Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, what we're going to be doing that today. Hopefully, you've already watched the video concerning the syllabus. What I'm going to do today, we're going to make at least one video, maybe two, going over the first part of what we're going to be doing for the first part of the class. And today, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the Texas Constitution. Okay. We're going to talk about where it's from, how it's formed, how it's similar to, yet also in some ways very dissimilar to the U.S. Constitution, these kind of things. Okay. Well, when you look at the Texas Constitution, while there's been numerous Texas constitutions during the history of Texas, ranging from the Constitution under Spain to our current Constitution, the Texas Constitution today is based on the Texas Constitution of 1876. This is the Texas Constitution that was adopted towards the end of what is known as Reconstruction, when the southern states were being readmitted back into the United States, the Union, as full-fledged states. Okay, and so it's been our Constitution for 100 and almost 50 years now. Okay, this despite the fact that it is very poorly written and ill-suited for a large, modern, urban state. The Texas Constitution was written for a Texas that was very, very different. One of the problems with the Texas Constitution, and probably the major problem, is that when the founders or the people who wrote it, they weren't quite as highly educated as the founding fathers of the country. The Texas Constitution is a really great example of how not to write a constitution for a democratic government. Whereas the U.S. Constitution is probably the best example that we have in the world of how to write a constitution. And so one of the big issues with the Texas Constitution is that it was written in anger. The men who wrote it, and by the way, they all were men and they all were white males. The men who wrote it were angry over Reconstruction, where the traditional power, the people who traditionally had power in Texas for about a decade, had that power taken from them. And when the federal government took over after Texas and the South surrendered, losing the Civil War. Not only that, they were forced to accept the equality temporarily of the former slaves, their former, literally for most of them, their former property. And so they were very, very angry. And there's an old saying about making decisions. It's a really bad idea to make decisions when you're angry, because you almost always end up making decisions that you will later regret, that there are serious problems with that decision. Okay, because when you make a decision when you're angry, you tend to discount all kinds of other very important, very irrelevant issues, and you focus solely on what was making you angry. Well, this is in fact what happened with the Texas Constitution. And so what the founders tried to do, the writers tried to do, is they tried to anticipate all the policy issues that the state of Texas would have to deal with, and try to write a constitution that addressed those issues. Instead of letting the legislature and the governor, the legislative branch and the executive branch, do what they should be to do their job, which is to make laws, to make rules that fit the current situation that the country, the state, whatever finds themselves in. They try to make all those decisions in 1876. Well, as you can imagine, there's no way to do that. Just like today, back then, they didn't have a silver ball. or crystal ball. They could not look into the future. They could not see where the country was going. And if you know anything about the last 150 years, you know that the state of Texas, the country, and indeed the world has changed radically from when it was 1876 until today. It's basically a different world than what the people who wrote, the men who wrote this Constitution, lived in, and the experience and everything that they had. Well, what was one of the negative side effects of them trying to make decisions concerning public policy well over 100 years in advance? Well, the problem was the world changed. And as it changed, the state of Texas needed to change with it. The problem is the Texas Constitution did not allow for the state to make many of those very important changes that it needed to make. The legislature simply could not pass a legislation signed by the governor and enforced by the governor to address with the new policy issues that came up. And so one of the things that resulted in this is that instead of simply writing legislation, which is relatively speaking easy, Texas has had to change their constitution over 640 times in the last 140 something years. And if you do the math on that, okay, that comes out to be somewhere around 4 or so, 5 changes per year. And so on average, we change the Texas Constitution 4 or 5 times every year. Okay. This is a bunch. Now, Texas doesn't have the lead on this. I think this is Alabama that's that, and they have over 900 constitutional amendments, which means their constitution is even worse than ours, which is hard to believe. Well, to give some comparison to this 630 amendments, how radically bad this is, we can compare that to the U.S. Constitution. Now, as I mentioned, the U.S. Constitution is probably one of the greatest examples, or the greatest examples, of how to write a constitution for a government. And in over 200 years, okay, approaching 250, 240, we've only changed the Texas Constitution, or the U.S. Constitution, I'm sorry, 26 times. I think it's 27 now. 27 times. Okay. A fraction of how many times we changed the U.S. Constitution. But this doesn't tell the whole story. When you look at the Texas Constitution compared to the U.S. Constitution, well, the U.S. Constitution has been changed, has 27 amendments. Not all of those are really true amendments in the same vein as the Texas Amendment. Okay, many of you probably have heard of something called the Bill of Rights. And many of you probably know that that is the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Okay, now some of these amendments are much better known than others. I'm sure every one of you have heard of the First Amendment, the Second, probably the Fourth, almost certainly the Fifth. And then these other amendments you may or may not have heard about. But those first 10 really weren't changes to the Constitution per se, in the sense that the Texas Constitution amendments were. When the founding fathers were creating the U.S. Constitution, the man who had the most influence over how the U.S. Constitution was created was a man named James Madison. And it most closely followed his beliefs concerning government, what powers the government should have, how the government should function. And Madison thought that he had created a system of government where the government could not abuse the rights of the people because the people controlled the government. And so when they originally created the Constitution, there was very limited amount of personal freedoms, personal rights written into the Constitution. There's really only three: no ex post facto laws, no bill of attainder, and writ of habeas corpus. Okay. Outside of that, there were no guarantees in the U.S. Constitution for individual rights. Well, when they put forth the current Constitution for ratification, two camps quickly emerged. There was the Federalists who supported it. There was the Anti-Federalists who opposed it. And one of the major issues, probably the most important issues that the Anti-Federalists had, was they were afraid that the government that Madison and them were putting together would abuse individual rights because it gave the federal government so much power, more power than what it had under the previous government or Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Okay. Well, they said that, hey, we need rights in the Constitution to protect us against the government. Well, James Madison didn't really think this was a problem, but he really wanted his Constitution, his government to be put in place. The country really needed it. It needed to structure. It needed to have a strong national government to do things that need to be done, such as national defense, to promote economic growth, all of these kind of things. And so what he did is he went to, or basically told the people whose main problem was a lack of rights. He said, okay, I tell you what, if you pass the Constitution, I promise the first thing that Congress will do when I'm there, because he assumed he'd be elected to Congress, and he was, he said, one of the very first things that happens is that I'm going to introduce amendments to the Constitution to protect individual rights, to take care of these issues that you have concerns about. Well, Madison, people like George Washington, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and others backed that play, said, yes, we will promise this if we go ahead and ratify the Constitution and put it in place. Well, Madison had, especially Franklin and Washington had, enough respect, enough standing that most of the opposition to the Constitution went away. And they were able to ratify it. And it became our current Constitution. And true to his word, the very first Congress that sat, one of the first things that Congress did was that James Madison introduced 12 amendments to protect individual rights. 10 were immediately ratified. And you may guess it, that they became the Bill of Rights. The other two weren't, although one of them would eventually be ratified 205 years later. It finally got the 3/4 of the state legislatures to vote for its ratification. And so when you look at the U.S. Constitution, you really have to take out those first 10 because they were part of the process of getting the Constitution ratified. They really weren't changes that were made later on when there were issues that cropped up. We needed a change to a Constitution in order for the government, particularly the federal government, to be able to address policy issues that the people said needed to be addressed. And so that drops it down to 16 or 17. Okay. Well, when you look at these 16 or 17 constitutional amendments, most are for very important things. One, lower the voting age from 21 to 18, making 18-year-olds full-fledged citizens. That was the 26. The 19th Amendment, ladies, which you should be familiar with, hopefully, not just gave women the right to vote, but made women full citizens. Okay. Other amendments that were very important would be the 25th, which set up the line of succession for the president. These kind of things. Other one allowed for the income tax and other stuff. There are really only 4 amendments, or one amendment that wasn't major, that made fundamental changes. And 2 of the most important, or the 3 of the most important, are known as the Civil War amendments. Okay, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that abolished slavery, that in effect made all Americans equal, and these kind of things. Okay. Now, there is 2 amendments to the U.S. Constitution that ended up being more or less frivolous. And that one is the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition, and the 21st Amendment that appealed prohibition. Prohibition was probably the greatest social experiment that America ever had. Up to prohibition, most people thought almost all the ills of society, there was a group of people, not most, but there was a group of people who thought all the ills of society were the result of alcohol. That in Americans throughout the first 100 and something years of our history, we drank a lot of alcohol, like most people did. One of the reasons why we drank so much alcohol, particularly beer and wine, to a lesser extent liquors, is that in many places, water simply wasn't safe to drink. Unless you had a secure well of some form that you knew the water was pure, drinking water could be dangerous. And so people drank beer. That was very common. Now, it would be what we would call a near beer. It would only have 1 or 2% alcohol. But the process of making the beer, and even that small percentage of alcohol in the beer, helped keep pathogens at bay or limited them, so it was safe to drink. But because the alcohol content was low enough, it didn't dehydrate you. As any of you have ever drank, 4, 5, 6 beer, 10 beer in a row in a short period of time, though, you have to use the restroom a lot and you dehydrate. It tends to dehydrate you. And so they thought the problem was alcohol. And so we passed the 21st or the 20th Amendment that said, okay, no more alcohol. It was no longer legal to sell alcohol in the United States. Well, the problem was, while a significant minority of the population, about maybe 40%, were more or less supportive of this, there was a huge part of the population who did not support it. And when Prohibition went into effect, huge numbers of Americans went from being law-abiding citizens to being criminals, because they refused to stop drinking alcohol, whether it be beer, whether it be wine, whether it be some type of liquor, distilled spirits. And this led to the era of Prohibition. And the only group that really benefited from Prohibition was the criminal era, or the criminal element. This is when the mob, whether it be the Italian mob, which is what most people think about, whether it was the Jewish mobs, whether it was the Irish mobs, this was a period where organized crime gangs, or organized crime groups, just ran the U.S. cities, ran amok, killed a lot of people, generally in crossfires, fighting amongst themselves, that kind of stuff. And while they had been there before Prohibition and had been somewhat powerful, they were limited in what they were able to make money in. They had extortion, where they forced businesses to pay on protection. They ran prostitution rings, these kind of things. Drugs, as we think about it, wasn't a big deal yet. Matter of fact, many of the drugs we think of today, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, you could go to the store and buy it over the counter. Okay. But they weren't widely considered a problem, and they were legal, so there was no reason for the criminal gangs to get into them. But alcohol opened the door for them. All of a sudden, they had a way to make huge amounts of money. And to give you an idea, it is estimated that Al Capone, many of you probably heard of him, they're in Chicago, was making about $60 million a year back in the 20s. Okay. And so that's a tremendous amount of money. And so it caused all kinds of problems. People were criminals, became criminals, that kind of stuff. At the same time, some of the wealthiest, most powerful families in America got their start bootlegging whiskey and liquor and alcohol. Probably the most famous of these families are the Kennedys. And I'm talking about John F. K., all of those, that group. Their father made his fortune in bootleg whiskey, okay, that he brought in from Ireland. Okay. And so, though that was going, they realized it didn't work. They then passed the 21st Amendment that repealed prohibition, and it made it legal then for states to allow alcohol. Some immediately did. Many in the South banned liquor all the way up through the 70s. And they had problems with moonshiners and all that all the way up through the 1970s and bootleggers and all that. And it still goes on today. People still make bootleg moonshine whiskey because it's cheap. They don't have to pay taxes on it, so they can sell it for less. And they often sell it in the major urban areas where people can buy a shot glass for $1. And this stuff is super strong. And they're not real safe about how they do it. And so it can also make you blind, if not outright kill you, if you get a batch that's bad. Well, so the U.S. Constitution, we barely had to change in over 200 years. And the main reason why was that the founding fathers set up the basic framework of government, the basic powers, the basic restrictions on government, what it could and could not do. And then it allowed the Congress and the president, along with the courts, to adjust what policies we did. And one of the things that really helped the U.S. Constitution is that in many ways it was somewhat vague. And so while we've only changed the U.S. Constitution 20-something times, physically, we've changed the written the written form. Every year, the U.S. Supreme Court, federal courts in general, make small changes or sometimes large changes to the Constitution through what's known as judicial interpretation. Whereas where the Supreme Court, particularly because they're the ultimate arbitrator, changes its mind as to what some part of the Constitution means. Okay. The Texas Constitution and the Texas court systems really weren't set up that way. Part of the problem with the Texas court system is that they're elected as opposed to being appointed for life like the federal system. And we'll get more into that later on in the semester when we talk about the state courts and compare them to the federal courts. And so the Texas Constitution has so many amendments because it did not allow the Texas legislature and governor to make changes that they needed. And so often when society changed, the economy changed, the world changed, the Texas Constitution couldn't adapt to it. And so they had to change the Constitution itself. Well, why is that a problem? Well, that is a problem because changing the Texas Constitution is a much more difficult process than simply passing legislation. Now, as we will talk about later on in the semester, when we talk about the process in which to create laws here in Texas, you'll realize the process of creating laws in Texas is not easy. There's a lot of points in the process in which a law or a bill can die and never become law. But changing the Constitution is even harder. Well, when it comes to changing the U.S. or the Texas Constitution, I'm sorry, okay, it's a two-step process. Okay, the first is what's known as a proposal, and the proposal process is partly fairly easy, easier than the proposal process for the U.S. Constitution. And all it requires is a member of the House, a member of the Senate, to propose a constitutional amendment in their respective chambers. Then each chamber must pass the constitutional amendment by a 2/3 supermajority vote. Now, when it comes to passing laws, all it takes is a simple majority. And the difference between a simple majority and a supermajority is simply this. A simple majority is 50% of the vote plus one. So let's take the Texas House. There's 149 members. Okay. You need half of those plus one. Okay, well, half would be 79 votes. Okay, if you have 78, it doesn't work. Okay, because you got to have half plus one vote. So all you need is one vote over half. 50% is 50% plus one vote. A supermajority is 2/3 vote, or 66%, or 66, technically 66 and a third percent. Okay. And so if you take, say, the 100 vote Senate in the U.S. Senate, it would require 67 votes, whereas a simple majority is only 50 votes, plus one, which would be 51. And so it takes 16 more votes to get a supermajority. Now, that might not seem like that big of a deal. You may say, well, we're only talking about, 16 votes. But as you get above 50% in any chamber or any population, if something is at all controversial, and generally speaking, if something is requiring a constitutional change, it probably is at least somewhat controversial. The farther you get above 50%, the more difficult it is. The more likely you're going to have people who oppose you. Not only are you more likely to have more people oppose you, but their opposition is going to be stronger the farther you get above 50%. And so getting a 2/3 popular vote in the Senate or in the state legislature is not easy. So you got to get 2/3 in the House, 2/3 in the Senate. If you miss by one vote in either chamber, your proposal dies. And you've got to repropose it if you want to try to change the Constitution. But let's say it's fairly popular, and you're able to get the 2/3 vote in both chambers. Both chambers pass it with a 2/3 vote. Next comes what's known as the ratification process. Okay. Lay down. The ratification process. And ratification is the process by which a proposed amendment is passed and becomes effective, becomes part of the Texas Constitution. Okay. And in this, you simply need a majority vote, simple majority vote of all voters in a statewide election. And so to ratify Texas constitutional amendment, The voters of the state of Texas get to decide. They get to vote. This was done because in many ways, it's one of the most democratic parts of our process, because the voters get to decide whether the Constitution gets changed, not elected officials, not elected members of the House and the Senate at the national or state levels. Okay? But one of the problems is, particularly in constitutional elections, is that participation rates, as we will talk about later, can be very low. And so you're not talking about a lot of people voting. Less than usually 10% of the population votes. And so you're not really getting a true sense of what the public wants, just a very narrow slice of it. The other significant problem with it is it means so much of what is a lot of constitutional amendments tend to be fairly localized. They just impact a relatively small geographic area. Okay. So to give you, and then that means people who have no idea what this is about, have no idea whether this is a good idea or not, have no idea whether the people who live there want it or don't want it, but they get to have a say yes or no. True story. This would have been probably about 1989 or so. I was right about 20 years old. Okay. I voted in an election, and this election happened to have one of the largest number of constitutional amendments ever. It had like 10 or 11 constitutional amendments. Well, most of them I had at least an idea about what it was, and I don't even remember what they were. I could go back and look and see, but I don't have an idea about what there were, because that was too long ago. Okay. But there is one that I remember. And I remember it because when I read it, I thought a couple of things almost instantly. And this had to deal with up in the Panhandle. Now, I lived about 100 miles south of Dallas, so I was 300 miles from the Panhandle or farther. And it had to do with about some kind of drainage district, whether they could do something. And I can't even remember the specifics of what they were wanting to do. But I remember sitting there looking at this constitutional amendment and going, I had no idea. Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I hadn't heard anybody talking about it. I had no idea really what it was. Yet I got to say yes or no. And so I'm sitting there trying to figure out, well, what should I do? Well, what I should have done, which I didn't, probably simply not vote, because I had no idea which one was good, or whether it's good or bad, which side or other, whatnot. But I was young and thought, well, I'm supposed to vote, so I'm going to vote. But because I didn't know how I was going to vote, I quite literally, and I, ladies and gentlemen, suggest don't do this. This is not something you should do. I reached into my pocket, got out a quarter, decided yes was head, no was tail, flipped the coin. I can't remember what it came up, but of course it came up heads or tail. Whatever it was, that's how I voted. The problem with it is, and the problem with the Texas Constitution being ratified through a popular vote, is that very few people vote. And so just because it passes or fails doesn't really give you an indication of what the American people want. Second, you have people making decisions about it who have no idea maybe about whether this is a good idea, whether this is a bad idea. People clear across the state will decide or help decide whether you can do something in your local community. And that is problematic. Almost all of these local issues are things that the legislature should take care of, that the legislature, along with the governor, should pass a piece of legislation to address that issue. But because of how the Texas Constitution is written, they can't. And so we keep on adding constitutional amendments on. Now, we did back in 1976 when I was a young kid. There was an attempt to change the Constitution. They have made some changes to it. I mean, it was horribly written. A lot of errors, grammar, and otherwise. I remember when I had just started college, and I was taking this class, by the way, Texas government, there was a sentence in the Texas Constitution that was some 800, 900 words long. One sentence. You talk about the run-on sentence from hell. I mean, if you would have turned that in to your English professor, they would give you an F, if not just on the paper, maybe for the course. I mean, that's how bad that was. It was a full page without a single comma, period, question mark, colon, semicolon, nothing. So it's really horribly written. And so everybody in that votes, you have to get 50% plus one vote. And so you could have something that's more local and people who have no impact from it could vote it down. And that happens. Or stuff gets passed that the vast majority of the voters would not support, but it passes because almost nobody voted. All right, well, that's the Constitution, okay? When it comes to the powers and the organization of the Texas government, it's very similar to what you see at the federal level. There's a system of checks and balances, the separation of powers. We have a judiciary who's independently elected. We have a legislative branch with two chambers that's independently elected. Then we have the executive branch. Okay. And just like at the national level, the powers of government are divided amongst these three branches, okay, of government. Okay. And so there are three independent branches with power. Okay. Well, how that works and how these branches work and what they do, we'll cover later on in the semester. But they're the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And they have three distinct functions. Okay. And very much like at the national level, very much in the ideas of James Madison, it pits power against power. Now, for the last 20 years or so in Texas, because the Republican Party dominates everything, will always win the governor, lieutenant governor, control supermajorities in the House and the Senate. They have most of the judgeships, most of the Supreme Court, that kind of stuff. There's less control or friction amongst the three branches because they tend to be ideologically similar. And so they tend to agree on the vast majority of things. Now, there's things that people can disagree, but they tend to agree. Okay, that is the Texas Constitution. Okay, what I'm going to do, we're going to stop with that for now. You need to watch the video, obviously, and we will be posting another video carrying on the first section to help you for your first test. Okay, chances are should take us, hopefully this video should take us till we meet in person. But you have a great day, and we will talk to you hopefully in a couple of weeks. Goodbye.